questions on both sides of the Mediterranean. Um, and Throughout the Middle East as well as Europe, migration and refugees have been cast as a challenge, a burden, a security threat, a cultural threat. But upon closer examination, and despite the animosity that we see in the media or political campaigns, as well as at times on the streets, migrants have regularly proven to be assets in the countries in which they live. Across European economies, with an aging population at risk of losing its capacity to sustainably finance public expenses, especially pensions and care for retiring workers, migrants are a lifeline. In 2015, when Europe witnessed a historic wave of refugee arrivals, Germany agreed to host the lion's share of the refugees that reached Europe that year, many of them having walked hundreds of miles across the continent. Today, refugees in Germany who arrived 10 years ago, often not knowing the language, are already achieving a labor force participation rate of 67%. The EU average for labor force participation is 70%. So they've almost achieved the full level that we see across the continent. Spain, the country that I've migrated to in Europe, is now among the leading OECD countries when it comes to economic growth, 3.2% last year. And according to Goldman Sachs, that's largely thanks to high levels of immigration. Spain's central bank credits immigration with 20% of the country's GDP growth in the past 20 years. And throughout the MENA region, migrants have been deeply woven into societies. And in the more recent period, Syrian refugees in Cairo have established schools and vibrant businesses, as well as, frankly, improving the food scene in the country quite a bit. But nonetheless, anti-immigrant sentiment across Europe has fueled a rise in anti-immigrant parties, not only from the far right, but even from centrist and center-left parties, as seen in Denmark. In response, European leaders trying to hold on to power have often adopted anti-immigration positions in the hope of convincing their publics that they will manage this issue, but accepting this idea of migrants as a threat rather than an asset and a resource for their societies. And they've pursued a series of immigration agreements with their southern and eastern Mediterranean neighbors, anchored in efforts to stem the arrival of migrants and refugees, especially those traveling irregularly, while Europe continues to try to externalize its borders, working to shore up the capacity of states in the southern and eastern Mediterranean to act as host countries, often, however, with an emphasis on securitization rather than actually improving conditions for migrants and refugees in those countries to remain. The results have been predictable and disappointing. European funded security forces have been found to engage in a host of violations. In Tunisia, we've seen reports of refugees being literally dumped in the desert by Tunisian security forces. The Guardian reported systematic sexual violence by Tunisian security forces against migrants and refugees. CNN found in Libya that militias rebranded as the Coast Guard and receiving European funding were violently shaking down families of migrants for money, only to eventually traffic them to Europe after having taken money from the EU to prevent them from leaving Libya. And in Egypt, there was the adoption of the worrying asylum law that fails to uphold critical rights for refugees, while we find that the Egyptian authorities have been regularly forcibly returning Sudanese refugees to Sudan, despite the continuation of war and famine in the country, in violation of the Geneva Convention's guarantees against non-refoulement. But externalization hasn't only contributed to funding securitization and these abuses. Along with externalizing borders, these policies have also externalized the anti-migrant sentiments that were popularized amongst many European countries. And we see that Tunisian leaders have adopted the racist great replacement theory in their rhetoric, and across the region, broader narratives that if migrants and refugees might be a threat in Europe, why wouldn't they be a threat here at home? And is that why Europe is asking us to host them instead? And despite all of this, I think that there are much more productive and constructive ways to engage with these issues. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our expert panelists on both the challenges in the current approach, as well as some things that have been working, along with how policies can be adapted and improved in a realistic way to improve the conditions for refugees, migrants, and their host countries, as well as safety in their transit. And so I'm joined by an excellent panel of speakers here that you have for you. Let me start with my old friend, Tarek Majrisi. He is a senior policy fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. His work mainly addresses European policymaking towards the Maghreb and the Mediterranean, and he works to find ways that policy can become more strategic, harmonious, and incisive. He also has a long-term focus on Libya. Dr. Diana Reyes is the program director of the Faith and Global Health Initiative at Georgetown University's Global Health Institute. She's a global health scholar, and her work explores how political crises, migration, and faith intersect to shape health systems, behaviors, and policy. Mohammed Lutfi is the executive director of the Egyptian Commission for Rights and Freedoms, a leading Egyptian human rights organization that has gained credibility through its courageous work on a range of issues, such as enforced disappearances, freedom of expression, minorities, and refugee rights. And my colleague, Nadine Hishin, is a legal associate here at the Tahrir Institute. She is an international criminal and human rights lawyer who has been working on the conflict and human rights in the Middle East since 2016. And before I turn to my panelists, I just want to say this is part of a broader area of work that TIMEP has been pursuing on migration policy and the impact of both domestic issues and securitization of migrants, as well as looking at alternatives from a legal and human rights perspective, as well as an economic perspective, hoping to promote inclusive policies that better conditions in both the MENA region as well as in Europe. And so with that, I'd like to start by turning to Tara and asking, you've been engaging now with European governments on migration and their engagements across North Africa for several years. Can you please speak to the efficacy of the current approach to managing migration and reducing irregular migration flows? Are they successful? What has been the human cost of the current approach? And what are some of the key flaws you see in the policies that are currently being undertaken?
Thanks so much, Tim. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. And really, thanks to TIMEP for letting me be part of this intimidatingly good panel on this very important issue. I mean, I like to call it the manufactured crisis of our generation, and that kind of lends to the first bit of the multi-tiered question you asked me, Tim. How effective is this solution? And I think it speaks for itself that what are we in 2025 now? So every year for the last 10 years, we have been in the midst of a migration crisis. And I think that almost tells its own story. And, part of the reason for this is the policy approach, so to speak, which focuses heavily on this idea of securitization. It's essentially a fake dichotomy that's created, whereby politicians will simplistically put the image towards their electorates that your borders can either be open or they're closed, and if they're open, they are unmanaged, they are chaotic, and we must restore order. Therefore, we must close borders, and that doesn't really work. I mean, it's not an approach that is reflective of the reality of the human condition, of the complexity of the situation, etc., etc. And it's a very security-centric framing for the topic. And I say security-centric because, security folk, they think a bit differently to policy folk. With security folk, you have a threat, you neutralize the threat. And this lends itself to that, which is why the issue of migration management has gradually migrated, no pun intended, over the years towards interior ministries and defense ministries. And so we have a situation today where the Europeans are effectively trying to build a wall in the middle of the Mediterranean, or the Brits are trying to do the same thing in the English Channel. And like I said, and like you guys can all see, it hasn't worked. I mean, to kind of zoom in on this for a minute, we saw the first kind of approaches or attempts at this policy by the Italians back in 2015. Like you said, making deals with Libyan militias to turn them into coast guards, etc., etc. And over the next 4 or 5 years, the migration main route moved from Libya to Tunis. And then more recently, we had this Team Europe approach with Qais Said to force him, as you explained again, to very violently stop migration from Tunis. And over the last few years, the main migration route has moved from Tunis back to Libya, but also to Morocco, with migrants leaving from Morocco either to Spain or to Spanish territories like the Canary Islands and so on. And so you can see that no matter how much money is expended or no matter how much force is used, we only really get two products of this. One, we continue to get migration. But secondly, we make it a lot more dangerous for the migrants that are crossing, which means also that we don't actually know how many migrants are crossing. And I'll give you a quick example of this. You know, the EU has deployed a naval mission to the central Mediterranean since I think about 2015, 2016. It's not so much about migration, it's about Libya and trying to police the arms embargo there. But until 2019, those vessels also would rescue migrants at sea until some governments like the Austrians and others kind of put forward this fallacious argument that it actually creates a pull factor for migrants. Well, if we're rescuing them, then more are just going to come. But it's not true. But nevertheless, they removed that mandate from those naval vessels. And so Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and other rights organizations will now point to something called ghost ships. So we don't know how many boats are leaving because these are all done illicitly or under the cover of darkness. And so we track migration by how many boats we spot, that come onto radars, that call for help, or that arrive at their destinations. Do we know how many hundreds of ships have gone and have just sunk quietly in the sea? How many thousands or tens of thousands of people are now at the bottom of the sea? No, we don't, frankly. And some rights organizations have called the Central Mediterranean crossing now the most dangerous in the world. And I know I said that, that has created two effects, but let me create a third, or let me mention a third. You mentioned the kind of great replacement theory that Qais Said started talking about. And this speaks to something I won't go down to, but it speaks to the conceptualization of migration in European political circles, which is, really a very US approach to framing citizenship and framing our societies with this very overly simplistic view of ethno-nationalism. But the result is that you get this almost trickle-down racism, to lend an economics term, whereby, all of a sudden now in Tunis, which prior to Qais Said's regime, they had open borders policies to a lot of African states, trying to bring in young African students, develop these kind of ties. But now all of a sudden, Black people are the enemy, or the sub-Saharans are the enemy, because they are trying to replace us. And that means that even Black Tunisians come under threat. And it means that even North African countries, which also benefited from migration, I mean, in Libya, for example, there are millions of migrants doing the everyday jobs that most people don't want to do. But now all of a sudden, even these people are now treated as a threat, and something to be contained or to be sent back or to be treated like a security threat. And I'm going to end on this point that, you're an economist, Tim, and I'll paint in economic terms why the securitization approach to migration doesn't work. And it's almost like a supply-demand function. You have a large amount of people from not just Africa, from all over the world who would like to come to Europe for issues such as chain migration. They have communities that already exist here. They see that there are job opportunities here. They see that it is a safe and prosperous place for them to come and settle. Reasons like that. And Europe at the same time actually has a desperate need for migrants. I mean, the former EU Home Affairs Commissioner, Ylva Johansson, said a couple of years ago, I think, that the EU needs something like 2 million migrants in order to sustain itself economically and to keep its social system going. So if you have a situation whereby Europe really needs migrants and migrants really want to come to Europe, then they are going to come. All that European governments have done through securitization is actually to close off service providers, to keep using that economic language. So instead of being able to hop on an Air France flight and come to Paris, these people are now forced to put their faith and to put their trust in very expensive people smugglers, which sometimes then allows them to fall into the trap of being trafficked as well. And it forces them down this more dangerous route, and this route that is less easy for European governments to control. So ironically, the securitization approach only makes Europe less secure. And I'll end on that ironic point. Thank you, Tim. I hope I didn't go on for too long.
No, no, thank you, Tara. No, those were really all excellent points, and I fully agree with you that making it so difficult to find a legal pathway to come to Europe has created enormous opportunities for organized crime groups and human traffickers and smugglers, and created this whole economy of criminal activity that has compromised the safety of these of migrants and refugees alike. Um, I want to now turn to Diana. You're a longtime observer of Syrian migrant communities across Europe. What have you been seeing in terms of how host country policies have impacted the integration of Syrian refugees across the EU? And what's been working well in your view? Which policies and practices have been key impediments as well to their integration or sources of insecurity for them?
Thank you for your question, Tim, and for the invitation to be on this esteemed panel. It's always a pleasure to reunite with Time Up colleagues. So this panel is coming at a very important time for me. I've just returned from Germany, where I was in Berlin for a few weeks, working on a book project related to Syrian displacement and the prospect of return. So naturally, I had many conversations, not only with Syrians who were asylum seekers initially, but have now, most of them, achieved German citizenship, but also think tanks and policymakers in the government, as well as academics working on this issue. And the conclusion I came to is that it's a very tense time, I think, across the globe when it comes to the issue of migration, but in Germany specifically, it just so happened to be that this summer is 10 years since that the peak of the migration so-called crisis in 2015. And German media, German government, German stakeholders that are invested in this issue are really taking stock of what does the integration experiment look like 10 years on? Has it succeeded or has it not? When you look at the numbers, and I'm glad you led with some of the economic indicators of migrants in the EU more broadly, when you look at the numbers in Germany, when you consider labor market integration of Syrians specifically, but also other asylum seekers and migrants that came around the same time, the numbers are really positive. So the news is broadly good. You see that compared to before 2015, about 2/3 of all people who came in 2015 have some kind of employment, and the majority of those are full-time. And there's a positive trend in general around the unemployment rate when it comes to not only Syrians, but people coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, and so on. And when you look at Syrians in particular, they tended to integrate more quickly into the labor market than previous generations of refugees. And that's something that's really tangible when you're in a big German city and you look around and you see Syrian businesses, be it restaurants or especially in areas where it's more ethnically diverse, and so-called Arab Street and Berlin, you see a ton of Syrian businesses, all taxpayers to the German government, all very much aligned with German bureaucratic processes, and it shows that to some degree the integration experiment has worked. And then you look at other indicators which are related to language learning and which eventually leads to the acquirement of citizenship, integration of children of refugee origin families into schools. All of these are showing positive trends in numbers, but when you look at the political situation, it's showing the exact opposite. And I'm going to touch on sort of this irony here that Tarek highlighted. When the current chancellor, who's part of the CDU, which was Chancellor Merkel's party, reflected on her call from 2015, which is that we can do this, we can integrate these, we can welcome refugees at a grand scale. He said that Germany had not succeeded in integrating refugees. And this political change is really a reflection of, I think, what's happening at the global scale. German and European society at large is concerned. I think just seeing very, very stark demographic changes, whether it's in their neighborhood or on the metro, in their streets, and their perception is that these people, in contrast to maybe places like the U.S. where people integrate a little bit more seamlessly, or the country's a lot bigger, so you don't have that kind of the tangible element of migration in your face day to day. In Germany, people are concerned that there are lots of people coming. They're taking up their taxpayer money is going to social services to support these individuals, and in turn, they're not integrating. But again, I don't want to go on this sort of negative tangent, because what we see from the numbers is that integration has been successful largely among, if we specifically look at the Syrian population, and that's largely because of the integration policies that Germany put forward in the early years of 2015. And now what we're seeing is more of a turn, not only in Germany, but other contexts, towards more stringent policies with regards to granting asylum. And I can't speak about the asylum-seeking situation of Syrians without addressing return and what the rhetoric around return has been, not only in Germany, but other European countries when it comes to the changes, and of course in Syria as of end of last year. So as soon as we saw the fall of the Assad regime, we saw European states either make an indication that they would suspend asylum applications, or very quickly moved forward in suspending asylum applications. And when I talked to Syrians inside of Germany, for example, about this, they were really concerned, because even those who have citizenship at this point don't necessarily feel comfortable going back to Syria in the current state, and are using a sort of wait and see approach. Maybe some have gone back to check on family or property, but don't feel like the country is in a state, if they don't need to go back immediately for personal reasons, to go back at scale. And this data substantiates this. When you look at UNHCR survey data, about 81% of Syrians who are in the EU plan to stay there at least for the next 12 months, and so the majority aren't thinking about return. But you see this tension between, what people are talking about in their day-to-day experiences, and what's happening at the kind of higher level in the political and media sphere around migration. And so ending on this, I wanted to echo sort of Tariq's point about securitization. And when you look at the human security component, when you make individuals who are now in your country and have achieved citizenship even feel that their citizenship isn't secure, or that they're not welcome in that context, then first and foremost, you're losing out on a labor market that you've integrated for the last 10 years or so, that has brought a lot of skills to the country. And they might feel motivated to return because of this feeling of unwelcome and the political climate. And then you're also losing out on the long-term kind of investment that you've put in terms of integration policies, and hoping that these people are retained and that they stay. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
No, thank you, Diana. Those are really important observations, and I couldn't agree more. I remember back in December of last year when Assad fell, and then all of these announcements came out about suspending processing of asylum claims and things of that nature. We immediately reached out to European capitals to caution against this and insist it was very premature. And the message we got back from everybody was, well, this is an interior ministry issue. It was like, how is it that your foreign ministry, with all of its expertise on what's actually happening, is not a critical part of this conversation, and you're leaving it to a ministry that frankly does not have that capacity. And the securitization is really kind of permeating domestic policy decisions as well. But I mean, I think to your broader point of this dissonance between what the numbers show and what the politicians say is something that Tara and I often say, which is that this is much more of a political problem than a policy problem, which also adds to the challenge of addressing it. I mean, in private, I can count on one hand the number of officials that have told me that we don't need more migrants. It's pretty widely understood across the continent that the population is aging, that the birth rates are just not high enough, and that migration is critical for the financial sustainability of European economies. And yet, in public, you could probably count on one hand how many leaders at least are saying this and vigorously. I mean, Merz is kind of speaking out of both sides of his mouth on this issue at times, and there's a lot of he's expressing the dissonance in one person, which is I guess helpful. But it's really kind of important, I think, for publics to realize the data that you're sharing, and if leaders could kind of disabuse or refuse to kind of accede to the claim by some political movements that migrants are a burden and a threat, and could demonstrate empirically that actually this is critical. That would be, I think, a better strategy, because a lot of these politicians have tried to embrace that xenophobia to survive, but in the process have actually empowered their challengers because they seem inauthentic. And so they're actually kind of paving the way for their own defeat in a sense. So no, I think you really kind of touched on some key issues, and I hope and in the next round of questions we can try to think about how to address this constructively. Um, Next, I want to turn to Nadine. Nadine, as a human rights lawyer who has studied the connections between refugee policy in the European Union and the MENA regions, can you share with us what you've observed in terms of shifting or deteriorating policies and the impact on the conditions refugees are contending with and the challenges that they face, as well as specific violations of their rights and sources of insecurity? What role, for example, has Lebanon's international partners played in these dynamics, either positively or negatively?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tim. Uh, on point with this, I would say is a study that I recently concluded with three wonderful colleagues in Europe, where we were looking at exactly, the return policies that were evolving in the EU and how that was possibly influencing refugee policy in the MENA region, looking specifically at Lebanon and Jordan. And what we found was that in the face of rising right-wing sentiments across Europe, most governments opted to play into the populist politics that you were just pointing out yourself, instead of reinforcing the importance of human rights and international law for everybody, not just for refugees and migrants, where they could have been undertaking awareness campaigns, public information efforts, advertisement, or even community building and social cohesion like they do in our countries when they're trying to make sure that refugees and the local population understand one another and are able to get along. So instead of making any of these efforts, it seems that those in power sort of foregoed principled leadership in a bid to maintain power. And this is a detriment to everybody. Of course, it puts refugees at risk. Sorry, the sun decided to suddenly shine right in my eye. So first of all, it puts refugees, of course, at great risk, both as Diana was just talking about in Europe, where people who've been there for years and years and have residencies and have maintained legal status the entire time are now terrified that they're going to be sent back. And we've seen with the recent shifts in the dynamics in Syria as well that there's been far less willingness by European actors to really hold the new interim government to the same standards that it was holding the Assad regime to. And this also puts people at much greater risk. At the moment, with everything that's been happening in Syria, it's very clear why so many people are reluctant to go back, and yet there still seems to be this push in that direction and a complete sort of avoidance of what's really taking place and how do we resolve it so that Syria can actually be safe for return. And so obviously, this is very much, these double standards have been very much noted by governments in the MENA region. We've seen several examples of governments here increasingly violating refugee and migrants' rights, engaging in refoulement, etc., threatening to allow refugees to make their way to Europe in, an attempt to pressure stakeholders to increase funding in exchange for basically externalized border control. So this is very problematic because it's no longer about a universal standard that everyone is upholding uh, and reconfirming. And, basically when we all follow one standard, it creates a certain level of shame, or when the majority are following a specific standards, it creates shame on those who are not. But right now we're in an era of shamelessness where people are basically doing whatever they want, depending on how powerful their political alliances are. And just to go back a bit to our study that we conducted, this was basically, the research idea was triggered by Denmark's very problematic decision in 2019 to declare Damascus safe for returns. And this was based on a problematic country of origin report that was produced by the Danish Immigration Services, where the report stated that since Damascus had not seen hostilities since 2018, it was therefore safe for return. This signaled a completely unprecedented shift in return policy, as it was never the case that part of a country was declared safe for returns, while other parts of the country were still in active conflict with atrocity crimes taking place everywhere, even in Damascus, despite the lack of active conflict. So this conclusion was condemned by some of the very experts that actually contributed to the report. They said that this misinterpreted basically the information that they had given, and that the drivers of displacement from Syria were still very much present. Finally, in 2024, so we're talking 5 years later, the European Court of Human Rights validated these criticisms and did find that the state cannot say that a country is safe if parts of the territory do not meet the necessary conditions for safety. So either the whole country is safe or it's not. There's no gray area. So at least this is one good decision from the European Court of Human Rights. But in general, we've seen a lot of manipulation of international law in Europe, sort of misrepresenting what it states and what would constitute refoulement and what would constitute abuses. I mean, we've all seen and now discussed the countless deaths that have happened at land and sea borders at the hands of European coast guards and border guards. And these are violations of the right to life. These are violations of the right to seek asylum. And yet we never see these actors being held accountable for these violations. So in the case of Denmark, we saw that for the thousands of Syrians who were from Damascus originally, who had their temporary protected status revoked, over 70% of these cases ultimately were reversed, and the people ended up getting a much higher protected status than they had before. So this again shows how these legal manipulations are taking place to sort of reframe the law in a way that's beneficial to European stakeholders. There's a lot more that could be discussed in this arena, but I think basically, Lebanon's international partners are trying to pressure countries like Lebanon and others in the region to respect laws that they themselves are violating. And this is politics of self-interest. It's not even national interest, like you mentioned. It's actually in the national best interest to be welcoming migrants and refugees and ensuring that they're integrated into society and becoming active members of their community. So it's really just about politics of self-interest and dominating and power plays are dominating the world scene and compromising human rights everywhere.
No, thank you so much for that, Nadine. I certainly agree with a lot with all of your points, but like there's a couple that really stand out, and I mean one of them is kind of the political economy that they've created by normalizing these types of deals, where a lot of leaders have figured out that if they allow or encourage irregular crossings, the result will be that billions of euros will come the opposite way, and so they're kind of creating this dynamic that encourages these sorts of activities and insecurity for the people who are being put through these irregular crossings, instead of trying to address the kind of structural issues in a sustainable way. And European leaders, if you speak, I mean, privately, if you speak with European officials, they're all aware of this and they all complain about it. But then at the staff level, but then at the leadership level, there's the short-term thinking and the political maneuvering kind of outweighs any considerations of what would be actually a better policy. Let me now turn to Mohamed Lutfi. Mohamed, you and your colleagues have been doing critical research on the conditions for refugees in Egypt. Can you tell us more about how Egypt is doing when it comes to hosting refugees? And given the 7.4 billion euro package that Egypt was promised in last year from the European Union, including a 5 billion euro macro financial assistance package that's just being finalized now, how have reforms that came explicitly or implicitly in response to this type of cooperation impacted asylum seekers and refugees in the country?
Hi everybody, glad to be with you guys. It's a very difficult question, Tim. Egypt has been a host country, a country of destination for refugees and asylum seekers and migrants for a very long time. The biggest community being the Sudanese has been in Egypt for generations. Obviously, the flow of migration and seeking asylum has increased with the recent conflict in 2023 Plus, end of 2023, we had the war on Gaza started, and many Palestinians, hundreds, tens of thousands of Palestinians have entered Egypt. And so Europe has looked at Egypt already from 2015 and 2014, around this time, that it was key to make sure that the Egyptian government is going to be cooperative in controlling its maritime borders, its borders with Libya, so that try to stop the influx of migration to Europe through the Mediterranean, etc. But that need has become even more great as the war in Sudan in 2023, and then the war in Gaza started. And so, indeed, Egypt was going and is still going through an economic and financial difficulties. The IMF is there, and there is a macro financial assistance coming from the European Union. There is the Gulf partners, etc., to stabilize the situation in Egypt, so that Egypt doesn't just melt down financially. And one of the consequences, in addition to instability inside Egypt, would be another big flow of migration. And so the Egyptian government had been in negotiations with the European Union, and a new law of asylum was adopted in Egypt and published officially as it in end of last year. And it's not like the situation of refugees in Egypt were okay or good, and then now it's bad because of the law. Situation of refugees and migrants in Egypt have been precarious for a very long time. Forced returns to Sudan and to other countries have been happening, even to Syria had been happening before this law was in place. Exploitation of the situation of refugees and migrants to regularize their situation in Egypt through decrees from the prime minister back in 2023 had been already adopted. Such decrees: you're a refugee or a migrant, you're in Egypt, you want to legalize your situation, find an Egyptian sponsor and pay $1,000, and you get that. And so it was in the making between 2023 and 2024. We saw and we heard a lot of rumors about a law being prepared. IOM did not know much about it. UNHCR said that they didn't know about it, and suddenly there's a draft law that was, going back to Tariq's point about securitization. The law itself, this asylum law, was drafted by the Defense and National Security Committee of the Parliament. So it tells you a lot about the mindset of this law. And the law has eventually taken away from UNHCR the refugee status determination mandate that it had, and gave it to a government committee, made Ministry of Interior, Finance, and two other ministers. Anyway, this committee is not yet in place. It's not working yet. The bylaws of the law were not adopted until now, although it's overdue. And that leaves refugees and migrants in a limbo situation, because they can't turn to UNHCR because it doesn't have the mandate anymore, and they can't turn to the committee that is supposed to exist and put the policies in place and examine requests. So what do you do? They are in limbo. They are in a very precarious situation. And then the authorities, the security authorities, the Ministry of Interior feels that this is a free hand to do whatever. Okay, so you have the legal basis to deport people. You don't have NHCR harassing you every now and then when it happens about detained refugees that should be liberated, and the refugees they are in limbo. And so we have seen a surge of arrests of refugees, even registered refugees with UNHCR. They do have valid UNHCR cards, being arrested based on the color of the skin, based on pure suspicion. I mean, there was this guy from Sudan. He's from Darfur, by the way. and he's a hairdresser. Okay, he's waiting for his papers anyway, and just by the color of the skin. Okay, you, what are you doing here? I am a UNHCR refugee. I have my card. You come with us to the police station. Okay, I can pay. I can prove to you that I am a registered UNHCR asylum seeker. No, no, no. Okay, some friends bring the papers. Okay, the police, what does the police do in Giza? This was in Giza early this year. They confiscate, the police confiscates the UNHCR card and makes a police PV saying that this person is illegally staying in Egypt and sends him into court. And the court decides, although the court decided to release him on bail, it's ultimately National Security Agency that decides the fate of any person. And so the man was deported to Sudan. So you have forced returns, you have compulsory voluntary returns. So if you're at a police station, there is no police PV, there is nobody who's able to ask about you. You don't have your mobile phone to speak with anybody. NGOs are overstretched with little resources to do anything. You don't have papers, so you can't have a power of attorney for a lawyer. So you are sitting with petty criminals, other detainees in a police station in Egypt. It's not, police stations in Egypt are reputable for ill treatment, and so you end up signing up a document saying, okay, I want to return. Okay, if you are forced to be put in this situation where you sign a document as a refugee to voluntarily return to where you came from, mainly Sudan, but also I've seen cases of people from Cameroon, from other countries. Anyway, so
That's
the
very.
law has. I'm going to finish here. The law is purely security related. It gives a free hand to the national security agencies to deport and arrest at will. And this means that Egypt, that was, relatively safe place for refugees to stay, especially Sudanese, is now becoming a push factor. And we have seen more and more Sudanese willing to leave Egypt, although they did not intend to do so in the first place. But the EU having expectations from Egypt to keep control, Egypt overdoes it, does it, and over securitizes it. It backfires with more Sudanese who now want to leave Egypt. And if I get another opportunity, I'll speak about the Palestinians also, which is a very precarious situation. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Mohammed. And sorry, I have been reminded by my colleague that I've perhaps been too generous with time. So in the next round, we're going to have to be a little bit, quite a bit more strict and try to keep it around 4 minutes. But no, I mean, to your point about the precarity resulting in Sudanese feeling uncomfortable staying in Egypt, even though they've long viewed Egypt as a host country in past conflicts and crises, we're seeing a lot of them crossing into Libya. And having to pay bribes to people reportedly affiliated with Ibrahim Arghani, who of course is a business partner of much of the leadership. I want to turn now back to Diana, and in this round. Also, I just want to remind our audience: if you have any questions, please enter them into the question and answer so we can consider them. And we're going to move quicker so we can try to get to your questions as much as possible at the end here. But Diana, as we're kind of looking towards what is the better alternative, or what lessons learned can be better applied, on both sides of the Mediterranean, we've heard refugees and migrants face a large number of challenges, yet they regularly find ways to overcome them and have made valuable contributions in all of their host countries. Given your observations in Europe, what can European governments and the EU do, whether it's national governments or as a bloc, to help reduce these obstacles and better help with creating mutually beneficial opportunities for integration into society and the workforce?
Thank you, Tim, and I'll do my best to be brief. I was thinking about your kind of phrase about how this migration isn't necessarily a political crisis, it's a political crisis, not a policy crisis. But what happens when the politics become so so demanding and put so much pressure on politicians and stakeholders that the politics become the policy. And unfortunately, I think that's what we're seeing around the globe when it comes to migration. The US is no exception. I see a question in the chat about the recent administration as well, and how that's impacting global migration policies, which no doubt it is. But when I recently was in Germany, I noticed that just in the last year, there have been major shifts in policies that were previously really good. I mean, reducing, for example, the requirement for residency from 8 to 5 years to allow for more fast-paced citizenship, or providing a very specific policy that allows people who've integrated at a very high level, whether that's, and that's indicated by language learning and acquiring a job and having a certain amount of finances, you can have a fast track to citizenship. We're seeing things like that being pulled back, more restrictive policies, including those that were that have been rolled out now with the Pact on Migration, that affects family reunification, the reception of benefits, and border controls and turning people away at the border. And so what we're seeing now is more of the policies that we've seen historically in the other countries in the region, as Mohammed and Nadine covered with Egypt and Lebanon. And bottom line is, when the integration policies are becoming more and more restrictive, you're losing out on the potential benefits of having these migrants in your country and capitalizing on their presence. So in terms of my suggestions, and I'll start with the piece regarding positive narratives, because there was a question in the chat about, what can European governments do to kind of push back against the right? And it's really about the narratives, because when you shape migration as kind of a burden, or burden sharing, or there's xenophobic rhetoric around certain migrant populations, that's going to only exacerbate the existing political situation, and therefore have impacts on force politicians to change policies to appease their voters. So my suggestion is, and I'm afraid as of late, we can't really rely on, well, these are our values as an EU bloc, or these are our values as the American people, in terms of being welcome to refugees. We have to change the rhetoric and really meet people where they're at. We have to highlight successful case studies of migrants who have contributed to society. We have to encourage the participation of migrants in political processes. This is something I saw in Germany, which was slightly disappointing, is that people who have achieved citizenship and who are willing to become more politically engaged, maybe run for office somewhere in the country, have felt really resistant now, or resistance from society in terms of taking up a public kind of a public position, or really spotlighting themselves in terms of running for office. But that's the key successful indicator of integration, is really becoming a citizen and then being able to participate in political processes. So I would say the narrative piece is one that's really important, that needs to be shifted, and that's not just on governments, but also NGOs and think tanks and people working on this topic, people like myself, who need to really change the rhetoric around migration. But then from the more concrete perspective, I think establishing more legal certainty around asylum processes. I think people living in these countries with the uncertainty of when they're going to actually achieve asylum or citizenship is really exacerbating. And so this is something that, unfortunately, with the pact seems to be, it will be more restricted, but I think is something that countries and the bloc needs to focus on, more transparency. And lastly, I think more holistic integration. So when it comes to integrating refugees, it's not just this labor market piece or education or family reunification, but it's also about overall well-being and community building and bringing people together. And there's been tons of positive examples of that at the local level. It's just about showcasing this and bringing it up at the national level and regional level in the EU. Thank you. I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Diana. Those are all great suggestions and founded in your observations of what has actually worked. I hope that policymakers are listening. I want to now turn back to Mohammed and ask, in light of the challenges that you laid out in your earlier answer, Could you speak to what the Egyptian government can do to both address the challenges facing refugees in Egypt and how they could create opportunities for them to securely and sustainably contribute in Egypt while accessing the rights of asylum seekers or refugees? And how can the EU work with Egypt through its partnership agreement to improve conditions and reduce the insecurity of refugees to avoid an increase in attempts at irregular crossings? With a deepening cooperation between the EU and Egypt and this upcoming summit between the EU and Egypt in Brussels next month, are there specific opportunities in this moment?
So first of all, refugees and migrants in Egypt, they need to feel safe in Egypt. They need to be to have papers that they are able to show the authorities so that they can feel themselves safe and secure in the country, whereby they can establish businesses, actually work and create jobs. I've seen a very successful experience with the Syrians in Egypt the past 10 years. Those who are in limbo when it comes to the asylum process with the current law on asylum, a bylaw needs to be adopted, but that bylaw needs to try to at least limit the damage that the law has done. Ideally, or obviously, amending the law itself and making it better and allowing UNHCR to have some role in that committee at least, and put criteria and timelines for the status determination. The EU has a lot to say on this. It's an opportunity, of course, that they're gonna have this summit. But at the same time, I have to tell you that Egypt also has a lot of leverage, and it does blackmail the European Union when it comes to migration. It tries to play, the Egyptian government tries to play a bit the Erdogan way with Greece. They do this, and Egyptian diplomats know how to bluff. So to me, that the EU has the money, it has the ability and the power to actually work with the Egyptian government for a better law, and limit the damage there. For the Palestinian situation, the Palestinians, they are excluded from all this. They are not. They are. It's like there is no. They are in a vacuum. There is no law that applies to them. Those who entered a year ago and over a year ago had only 45 days visas. And now they are in limbo. They are in complete limbo, and none of all the above I mentioned applies to them, which makes them even more insecure about what can happen to them. And UNRWA is unable to do anything. UNHCR says it's not our mandate. UNRWA says I can't do anything. And charity organizations and development organizations, well, they had also huge funding cuts. And so it's a compounded complex situation where perhaps the only answer for any father of a family who is worried about the future of his kid is to just leave Egypt and go elsewhere.
No, absolutely, and thank you for those points, Lefty. I think in general we do see this kind of game where or dynamic where everyone is kind of saying, I don't have any power, I don't have any power. The Europeans say they don't have any leverage. The Egyptians say we don't have any resources, and they just kind of all pass the buck around, and still somehow manage to spend billions of dollars on these things, but so unproductively. I want to come to Nadine here and ask that, given the momentum for reform that we're seeing in Lebanon, are there steps the Lebanese government can take to integrate migrants and refugees in the reforms that they're already pursuing, both to improve the respect for rights, as well as to address Lebanon's challenges in terms of its informal economy and the collapse in tax revenue? And how can Lebanon's partners in Europe help with that process and provide support?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. It's a big question. But basically, I mean, there's so much that the Lebanese government could do. There's an endless list, but first and foremost, civil society has been pushing Lebanon for a long time to ratify the Refugee Convention, which they actually had a very active part in creating, and helped create UNHCR once upon a time in the 1940s and 60s, before sort of this. We had an influx of refugees from Palestine, and I think the government started to see these double standards and that the people that had created the United Nations were violating the very dictates of its charter. And so things started to shift immediately from one where Lebanon was aiming to be a leader in refugee rights to one where they were turning their backs on rights and sort of following the lead of other countries. Lebanon only has one law on asylum, and it's very problematic. It's broad, it's vague, it actually gives power to, it's only been used once in Lebanon's history, and it actually gives power to, you know, folks who are tied to the government to make decisions on who gets asylum and who doesn't. So if the Refugee Convention definition was adopted, as well as the procedures, which would ensure an independent, unbiased adjudication committee, and also the right to appeal, because at the moment there is no right to appeal this asylum status, that would be a big step in the right direction. But in terms of the reforms that are already taking place in Lebanon, we need to ensure that we actually secure an independent judiciary. There was a law that was recently passed, which none of us have yet had access to, but rumor has it that it's very problematic and still does not meet international standards for an independent judiciary. And so I guess what we would ask for, not just on this reform, but on most reforms that are taking place across the country, is for partners of Lebanon to not only focus on financial and humanitarian aid, which of course the country needs. We need aid for reconstruction and for the protection of vulnerable groups, etc., but also moral and technical support in terms of these reforms that are taking place. There should be oversight, there should be input, especially from Lebanese civil society and legal experts in the country who have long been working on these issues. So we definitely need to secure an independent judiciary, and not just in the regular judiciary, but also in the military courts and the administrative courts. As you mentioned, for Spain, the same applies to Lebanon, where we benefit a lot from migrant and refugee labor, but we have no enforced minimum wage. So this creates sort of a drive to the bottom, pushing more and more people into vulnerability as they compete for lower and lower wages. That also means that they don't contribute much to taxes. And anyways, refugees and migrants are excluded from many or all aspects of the National Social Security plan. So everything needs to be reformed in the country, from the kafala system to Social Security to procurement policies. The list is just endless. And in the meantime, we're trying to capitalize on this window for change while we're being consistently bombarded on a daily basis. And over 900 people have lost their lives since the ceasefire took effect last November. So again, this is something, and there's also been a lot of attacks in Syria that have placed people in danger. So it's just a bit unfathomable to me to think about, durable solutions and the future when we're not even sure that our countries will be safe for hosting refugees. And I think probably in any other context, a country that's being bombed on a daily basis wouldn't be considered a safe third country. I think in terms of Europe, as I mentioned, a recommitment to the importance of the international rule-based orders, raising the stakes for actors violating human rights and international law, regardless of where they are in Europe, in the West, in the MENA region, etc. But I also think that Lebanon could potentially be a bit creative and increase and diversify its partnerships with other countries. I'm not an economist, but I know diversifying your portfolio is very important. So I think that's one step that really needs to be taken. And then it would also give more legitimacy to the government if they increase cooperation with states that are being seen taking the right road, such as Spain and Belgium, or even Colombia, which has shared many of the historical issues that we've been facing in Lebanon. So yeah, we need to get out of, hedging all of our bets on stakeholders that are simultaneously helping and harming us, and try to take a new creative path.
Thank you for that, Nadine. Those are a lot of great suggestions, and yeah, kind of a little bit of everything. But I mean that it also speaks to the scale of the problem and also opportunity in terms of how much more could be done and how much better the integration could be, benefiting both the host country and migrants and refugees who live in Lebanon. And I think your point is dead on in terms of kind of a failure of a lot of people to account for the conditions in Lebanon. In our engagements with a lot of Western capitals, we've often tried to encourage more resettlement and raising the numbers. I mean, the U.S. was taking in very few Syrians, for example, and we said, you know, it kind of becomes untenable for you to ask Lebanon to host as a per capita the largest refugee population in the world, while the U.S. was taking in, I think, 20,000 refugees in a country of 350 million people. For those of you who aren't familiar, Lebanon's citizen population is somewhere around 4.5, 5 million people, whereas the refugee population is around 1.5. So we've always been trying to encourage that, and that was even before the war. So I want to again encourage our audience to ask questions. I'm going to ask Tarek one last question before I start asking them your questions. So you get to decide what they say now. Isn't that exciting? Tarek, you've heard all these reflections from our other speakers on the cases they work on the complexity and the context, as well as the recommendations on what could work better. Do you think there's an overarching message for European policymakers, given your engagement with them, on how to amend their approach from one that relies on securitization and has oftentimes fueled insecurity and violence to one that recognizes migration as an opportunity for states on both sides of the Mediterranean? And what policies can they pursue with their partners in the MENA region to transition to a sustainable and constructive approach to migration governance that gives migrants and refugees the security and opportunities they want and deserve and have a right to, while helping to integrate them and so that they can contribute to the needs of their host countries as well? Nice, easy question.
And all that in 4 minutes. All right, let me try and craft this into an overarching narrative or one solution. I mean, the gift and the curse of coming after such a great group of speakers, I got so many things I wanna add to and I wanna build on. And I think first and foremost, you know, every single one of my other panelists have spoken about this problem of safe country designations that really have no place in law or in rationality or whatnot. And I think this is really indicative of how Europe's approach to migration and how this attempt to just close the border at all costs, pursue securitization with the blinkers on, it denigrates concepts like universalism, the rule of law, and so on, which are intrinsic to Europe also. You know, like I talked about trickle-down racism, but this whole thing, it's toxic and it corrodes not only the other side of the Mediterranean, but it comes back to European shores as well. And this doesn't just have, you know, future problems in terms of the application of rule of law on a politicized basis, who deserves rights, who doesn't. I think we can see an advanced version of that in the United States today. But it even affects the things which make Europe or modern day Europe Europe. So, you know, I was sitting with an unnamed, undisclosed, very senior official on migration in Europe about a year ago, and the conversation starts with, you know, migration and our current approach to migration is going to be the thing that kills the EU, because eventually it's going to lead to the end of Schengen because we cannot control borders in this way. And without Schengen, what's the point of the EU? And then the guy spent the next hour telling me exactly why we need to keep going with the current approach. And I think that sums up the situation in kind of a nutshell here. And it's like I said in response to the first the first question. It's this false dichotomy about either having borders that are closed or that are open. And I think we do a disservice to our electorates. And I think it was Deanna that was talking about, you know, claiming or reclaiming the narrative. And this is something that I kind of implore all politicians to do, because I have no idea why we're ceding the ground to the far right and to very simplistic narratives. You know, I speak with a lot of politicians, and it's always, you know, we must take this approach on migration in order to be taken seriously on what is a very serious topic. And I frankly beg to differ. And even polling that was done at ECFR also backs this up, in the sense that if you look at the kind of big issues on the table for electorates, migration isn't really up there, despite all of the talk, despite it dominating our media channels, and so on. So even with all this, the big issue for most people is the economy. And where people care about migration, they care about this idea that governments are incapable of controlling it, which again lends itself towards managing borders instead of treating them as either closed or open. Um, and just quickly in terms of reclaiming that narrative. Firstly, let's push back even against what I was saying. I use the supply demand metric. We all are at odds to, speak about how useful migrants can be. But it's more than that. A person's right to asylum or a person's right to exist in safety and security does not depend on their economic value. We shouldn't even be ceding that ground. We should be standing firm on kind of human rights and human decency. And I think when you engage with people on that level, you actually find a lot of resonance. Let's treat people, or let's expect better from people, and they don't often disappoint on that front. And in terms of how we can turn that into policy, if we can organize safe routes for people to come, if we can organize expanded visa programs. I mean, you mentioned Spain right at the start. The reason why Spain is so successful with migration is because it has a whole plethora of different visas which offer different ways to interact with the Spanish economy, whether you want to come as a student, as a seasonal worker, et cetera, et cetera. And so this way of regularizing migration actually creates more control for governments over who's coming in, how they're coming in, when they're coming in. And it restores the leverage of European countries to then engage, to go to Tunisia or to go to any state and say, look, we see a lot of human trafficking or illicit migration. We need to work closer together on stopping this. Otherwise, we can start withholding visas, et cetera, et cetera. So it restores leverage in that sense. My last point is that the current approach, just to criticize it one last time, is doing the exact opposite. Europeans are going across the Mediterranean and saying, look, please, I beg you, stop all migrants from coming. We will give you whatever you want. And so that means that the Europeans are surrendering all of their leverage, and it's actually allowing the dictatorships across the sea to just become extortion rackets. And to start extorting the Europeans. So instead, let's move from this dichotomy of closed and open borders towards managing them, towards visa programs, towards working with the private sector, and towards restoring universal rights like asylum, because it's better for everybody that way. Sorry, I know that was more than 4 minutes, but you gave me a lot of questions.
I apologize. I will have to be strict for the last set of questions from the audience. I'm going to limit you to 2 minutes, make it a little more challenging. But one question that I think really kind of, Diana, you're in a really great position to answer. Our audience members one of them was asking about, with the rise of these far-right parties, increasing talk and actual revocation of residency, even permanent residency, and many calling for large-scale deportations. What impact does it have on even like well-settled and established immigrant communities, even perhaps with citizenship in Europe? And what impact is that going to have going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. This, discriminatory rhetoric, which has, I think, isn't something new. It's been there since the beginning. I think as soon as people, touched European shores, they felt unwelcomed, and it was just from a very, personal perspective. They've just had to push past it, learn a language, integrate into a society that they feel already doesn't accept them, and also lament often. And this happens a lot when I talk to people, when I talk about the U.S. and its approach to immigration historically, is that they feel like they will never be fully integrated as a citizen, even if they do achieve that, kind of gold standard of citizenship, because of the history, the kind of identity of the country, and usually in Europe, they're more homogeneous societies. So when you look at even other migrant groups that have been there historically, there's this tension that's existed for generations. For example, of Turkish migrants to Germany, where they're never really fully German. They're always a person with migration background. So it's something that is long lasting, and it's not going to go away. And I understand and can really sympathize with the questions that are coming in about, well, how do policymakers then convince their voters and for example, German or Swedish or French society that, integrating these migrants isn't threatening the very identity of the country. And I mean, that's a tough, I think, really philosophical and, battle that the countries that experience change at such a scale have to contend with, and they have to, I think, really debate. The unfortunate thing is what's happening is it's being debated at the highest level, and refugees or people of migrant background who are victims of this narrative aren't able to contribute. And that's why I made that point earlier about the necessity to have these people represented, in politics, for example, so that they can push back against these narratives. And how effective have we seen that in places like the U.S. when we have minorities represented in government? So, this acceptance piece, I think it's going to really happen at the local level, and it's going to have to be sort of a bottom-up approach, because when you look at, I think, individuals, you see people who are marrying from other cultures and having children that are kind of with hybrid identities. You see children integrating in schools. And when I was in Germany, just hearing young, obviously Arab background children speaking German as fluently as somebody who's of German origin, you just see that it might take generations for this to take place, but there has to be, there can't be complacency. There has to be an effort from policymakers and the host country society to meet people where they're at. But that goes without saying that refugees also and people of migrant background do have to do their share as well. In addition to language learning and finding employment is, try and really absorb the most positive aspects of this new identity they have and this new society. But it can't be done with so much of the pushback that they're receiving in terms of rhetoric.
No, thank you. Yeah, I completely agree, and I think like a place where we really saw this pendulum was in France, where you have people who are third generation being still referred to as immigrants, and a generation that basically felt like they were permanently rejected from that identity. Really kind of challenged their ability to feel like that they could call France their home. I want to now. I have a question for Mohammed. So one of our audience members said that they were speaking to an asylum seeker in Tunisia, and they told them that they've deliberately been dressing up to look like a visitor or a tourist to avoid attracting the attention of the security apparatus. To what extent are you observing in your work that people are, because you said that people are being arrested based on their appearance, to what extent are you seeing people try to kind of like change how they're perceived by people, or how are they trying to kind of hide in some ways, even if they're in plain sight, because of the crackdowns and the kind of arbitrary arrests that they're facing?
Yeah, after some time, refugees, they know where the police patrols are going to be passing, where they stop, where their checkpoints are usually in in similar places in Egypt. So it takes a little bit of time to adapt, to adjust, to avoid those places. In Faisal, for example, in Giza, they know that around this time, you're more likely to get caught if you pass by there. And so people, they stay home. They avoid going out. Okay, this is something we have noticed also with the Uyghur refugees. It's a very small community in Egypt, but every now and then the police is looks for Asian-looking people, hoping to catch Uyghurs, and very often people from Tajikistan or Kazakhstan get actually arrested, caught in this situation. And they tell us they stay at home. They're scared to send their kids to school. They are scared to go out. They do go at night, so only in late at night they go and they walk around to bring the groceries or anything. So this is not a safe situation. So dressing up, I mean, perhaps some people do it, but I have heard personally from Uyghurs or Sudanese that they avoid some places or avoid altogether from going out from their homes when it's tense.
Oh, sorry, I muted myself. Thank you for that, Mohammed. We're even in the United States, we're seeing actually a lot of immigrants who are avoiding going to work and avoiding going out because of rising crackdowns. as of late. So it makes it's unfortunately unsurprising that you're observing that as well in Egypt. Um, the next question I'd like to direct to Nadine, especially given your experience with civil society and the intersection of civil society and policy and law. Um, One of our audience members is asking what lessons we can learn from the aftermath of the 2016 EU-Turkey migration agreement. And they're asking, are there examples of successful civil society or diplomatic responses that can be replicated in Lebanon or Egypt to mitigate harm to refugees in those countries or elsewhere?
That's a difficult question. Actually, I was going to discuss also this case that has recently been decided by the European Court of Human Rights, which is actually very unfavorable to situations exactly like this, where a dinghy just off the coast of Libya in international waters reached out to the Italian Coast Guard in an emergency situation. They transferred the call to Libyan authorities, who, when they came to conduct the rescue, actually ended up killing several of the people on board, or they fell and they drowned. So, and then the court in this case decided that despite the bilateral financial agreement between Italy and Libya, that this did not adequately show that Italy had control over Libya's authority with migrants and refugees. So this is a very bad precedent for all of our countries that have externalization agreements, including Turkey, because this basically then absolves those actors that are contributing funds in exchange for border control, that they will not be held accountable for the actions of the entities they're funding. So I would say what civil society can do is place pressure on their government, especially if you're in Europe, to stop funding entities that have committed lots of abuses against refugees, be they Frontex, the Libyan Coast Guard, or other security apparatuses in the Mediterranean.
No, thank you. And that is a very troubling precedent, especially when we're seeing with such frequency abuses that are being funded from across the Mediterranean. And you're right, there's been no accountability to speak of for any of the officials who've been behind these arrangements. And in some cases, even when the abuses are uncovered, the funding continues. And it's policymakers will tell you, well, it's complicated while they're funding literally people who engage in torture and other types of violence. So it's deeply troubling. For Tara, I wanna come to you and really kind of look at this question around what is you concluded your last remarks talking about how this has to go beyond just the dollars and cents of migration. And I think on the points that Diana was raising, also, like, perhaps also, I think we need to kind of reinvigorate the idea of citizenship, right? I think that fundamentally, some ideas of citizenship, especially with the rising kind of nationalist far right rhetoric that's being adopted by, frankly, people who are far from the far right, is still very exclusionary and kind of doesn't accept the idea of citizenship as a civil status, but rather still has this kind of like kind of blood basis, even though we, in theory, been moving away from that across European legal systems for quite some time. The Germans perhaps more late than others. But what is Europe losing if they can't make this transition and make credible their commitment to citizenship being this kind of universal civil status that all of its citizens enjoy equally, and in that context, with the violations that Dean has been pointing to in the agreements and in the behaviors of even European entities on the Mediterranean in terms of pushbacks and other types of dangerous and illegal activities with respect to irregular crossings. What are the consequences for Europe's image and credibility going forward, especially in a context where Europe is increasingly on its own, and needs to kind of forge a more kind of a compelling political kind of position vis-a-vis its partners, not only in the Mediterranean but globally, and the credibility of kind of its image as a global actor.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, firstly, I just want to come in on a framing issue. Like, it's not Europe failing to complete a transition to this more kind of mosaic-based citizenship, or citizenship based on rights and association. Europe is there. Europe has been there for hundreds of years. It is a product of European history, where you have large nations like France, like Italy, like others, that are actually, they themselves are mosaics of different ethnicities, and different groups, once upon a time, even different languages. And so, France from the French Revolution has this citizenship model based on rights and obligations. And this is why I mentioned in my first response, that it's actually a very American conceptualization of a very kind of simplistic form of race, and taking that approach to citizenship instead. And this ties in also to what I was saying before. Like, if we suddenly create a category of people where it's okay for them to not have any rights because they are illegal, which again is American language, or because they are migrants and they're coming from abroad, this also then corrodes our own protections, our own rights, our own justice systems. I mean, I saw another question that was referring to a case that happened in Italy earlier this year, with a guy named Osama Jim. This guy runs a kind of like dungeon in Libya, where they keep migrants, where they torture them, where they subject them to kind of brutal conditions, etc., etc. He was placed under sealed indictment by the ICC, and the Italian government kind of, they will claim that the paperwork wasn't filed properly by the ICC, but they essentially saw this indictment come through whilst Osama Njim was in Italy, and then took him and repatriated him to Libya instead of surrendering him to The Hague. And you see then, very ironically, you have Rome violating the Rome Statute. And, this kind of what some academics and others call necropolitics, it eventually it comes for us all. I mean, we see it with migrants who are dying in the sea. We see it with the genocide that's going on in Gaza. And you can take a kind of political approach and say, you know what? Even non-right-wing politicians use this language on migration, usually neoliberal politicians who kind of claim to hold the center ground, because it's actually a much easier cop-out for saying, like take the case of Ireland, where Ireland is now, having a growth in anti-migration sentiment based around the housing crisis. So the idea is that, your government services suck because of migrants, and because there are so many migrants who are coming in, and not because we have been privatizing this and selling this off to the highest bidder for the last 10, 20 years, and this is the product of that. And then, just to make matters worse, creating this kind of a migration system then creates its own vested interests. I mean, I saw an article last year in a British tabloid that the UK had its first ever migrant billionaire, because he's taking government contracts to hold asylum seekers in hotels whilst their asylum claims are not being processed. And so this is just, a few examples to show how this necropolitics approach to migrants, to asylum seekers, to trying to other certain groups of people is quite similar to the extortion racket analogy. The cost will always keep increasing for Europeans, and there will come a time where it's not limited to the other category of people. It will come a time when it includes you, and it includes everybody else as well, when you become less politically acceptable.
No, absolutely, and thank you, Tara. I think that's a good point. That a lot of the repression gets tested on the most vulnerable and easily marginalized group, and then gets brought into people that thought that they were safe from it. And I mean, I think, to be honest with you, we're seeing that unfold in a number of contexts. And so I think that's including in the United States. And so I think that's a critical observation as well. But I agree with you also that politicians it's much easier to scapegoat these groups for their own failings in the political class that's currently struggling to survive the rise of anti-migrant political parties had a lot to do with laying the foundation for their success um, by avoiding responsibility for providing good public services to their populations. We got 5 minutes left. Do if would it would you guys like to have a minute to kind of give like a concluding thought to our audience before we wrap up? Diana, you're nodding, so let me ask you to go first.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you all to my fellow panelists. I've learned so much from you, and thanks to the audience for their really thoughtful questions. I think the bottom line is it's a very bleak picture in terms of the future of migration policy in the EU and just where we're heading globally with regards to migration. But I don't want us to lose sight of what's actually happening, and I hate to say this term, but on the ground, or where people are, connecting with members of their host community, where there is positive integration, where we're seeing now generations of Syrian citizens in places like Germany or Sweden are contributing to their societies and their children now too. There's a lot of hope when you look I think, at the local level, at the individual level, community level, and I don't want us to lose sight of that. I think what needs to happen is this narrative shift that we've been talking about in the last half hour, and that's going to not only take the role of civil society organizations, which I saw somebody was asking about in the chat, which is very active, but has also received a lot of pushback just given the dominance in the media and of these far right groups regarding the issue of immigration. So just to end on a slightly hopeful note there, that the integration experiment, I think, has been very successful in contexts that I've seen firsthand, and that's because of the drive and desire from migrants themselves who really appreciate being safe and secure in their host country.
Thank you, Diana. I couldn't agree more. And I think an example of that is this excellent group of panelists who are largely migrants themselves, myself included. And I'm also the son of migrants. And I think we've done all right, and we've done all right by the places that we live. Nadine, do you have a kind of closing thought you'd like to share?
Sure. Just quickly, I would say, I guess to the entire global community, this is based on some feedback we received from a partner of ours from Syria, who was basically talking about how if the war in Syria had been stopped much earlier, the destruction of the country would have been much less than it is now, and a lot more people potentially would be able to return. And so just in general, I think addressing the root causes of conflict, of violence, of oppression, of stopping those things when they're happening and not waiting until an entire country is destroyed, is a way to reduce this issue from the core, from the root. And most of us want to stay in our countries anyway, so we would love to live here in peace.
No, absolutely. And I think that's also lost on a lot of people is that people are often moving out of necessity and a lot of times really challenging conditions. And I think a lot of people are mistaking them for just kind of seeking a free ride when it's quite the contrary. It's an expensive and very difficult process to migrate. Todd, do you have a closing thought you'd like to share?
Yeah, I've criticized a lot. Perhaps I haven't spoken enough about what should be done in its place. And, we always talk about changing the narrative. And I think it's important going forward that all those who kind of work in this sphere, we start directly challenging the narratives and the positions that are out there and reclaim the kind of reclaim the initiative. And that comes from, challenging the current rhetoric, which is based on fear and on hysteria, and saying, actually, we are seeking to manage borders, to better control the situation, to restore economic growth, and to apply what actually works. We are pursuing a competence-based approach, a rationality-based approach, and we're trying to move away from kind of demagoguery, from hysteria, from fear-mongering, et cetera, and an approach that works for everybody. An approach of bringing things into the public sphere into official spaces involving safe routes. It's not kind of pull factors or ways to give people a free ride, as you were talking about. It's ways to take migration out of the hands of transnational organized crime and criminal networks and restoring the state's ability to manage migration, to integrate migrants, to create a system that works better for everybody, and that's proven to work better for everybody. I mean, historically, look at the United Kingdom over various phases, Berlin in the time of Frederick the Great, the entire history of the United States. All of this goes to show that migration is a positive. We shouldn't be ashamed. We shouldn't be talking about it and trying to justify it. It's the other side who should be trying to justify this regressive position. So that's my final thought. Hopefully a more constructive one. Thank you.
I completely agree. Lutfi, you get the last word.
Yes, I mean, going back to the push and pull factors, it's not just about the refugees and migrants in Egypt. It's also about the Egyptians who may want more and more to leave Egypt because of the economic duress, political repression, and so I think part of the story maybe that we haven't spoken enough about is, well, our countries in the south of the Mediterranean need to offer opportunities to their own populations, economic opportunities, but that comes also through political reform. If people feel that the future is better, that they can, wait for a few years before things get better, etc., they are less likely to want to migrate. Mostly, if everybody where it goes bad wants to migrate, I mean, it will be a much bigger problem than what we are discussing now. Most people want to stay in their country. Most Egyptians want to stay in their country. They don't want to leave, but they want to live better. And it's only when things become completely untenable that's when their children leave. That's when they leave. And so we need to think about democracy, human rights, and political reform, and ongoing economic reform in countries of immigration as well, because ultimately that's is the prosperity of the citizens and their hope for prosperity and the prosperous life that drives them to leave their own countries and go elsewhere, whereby they would in a default situation or a normal situation want to stay in their own country and serve their communities and live peacefully in their own countries. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lutfi. I couldn't agree more. I think that you're touching on a critical point of a lot of these agreements, because of their emphasis on security and not the economy, have kind of helped actually exacerbate the problems that drive people to be insecure and eventually leave, rather than reduce that insecurity. I want to thank everyone of our panelists and also all of our audience for your time and for your insights and for your questions. And Time Up is continuing to do a lot of work on these really critical issues and trying to and putting forward actionable alternative policies in consultation with partners like our panelists, as well as a number of others. So please continue to follow us and all of our panelists in their important work.